Okay, so we have been talking about gender stratification. This is the fifth video lecture. And again, I want to make sure that I'm really clear here. The issue or the question, the issue for sociologists is not that there are differences. Differences are good, right? We're about differences. It's that the differences are not equally valued. And that specifically, and the pattern is that female ways of being are considered less than male ways of being. That's what we mean by by gender stratification, and that's really what we've been talking about: are the different kinds or the different manifestations of gender stratification. We've talked a little bit, or I have talked about women in work, right, earning lower wages, women in politics, and now I want to talk about some of the physical consequences, specifically as it relates to violence, right? So this illustration is actually one of my favorites because one of the observations is that this gender stratification actually even manifests itself in the way women are expected to dress, and the fact that women's clothing is more or traditional, typical standards of beauty, right? And that the standards of beauty that are assigned to women, high heels, for instance, limit her mobility, make it difficult for her to move through space. And in some cultures, right, the idea of having small feet, foot binding, is a characteristic that you would start, or a behavior where you would start binding a little girl's feet because they were considered more attractive, and you had to have small, attractive feet if you were going to attract a husband. Well, you fast forward, and after decades of binding your feet, you weren't able to stand. So these old women in some cultures weren't able even to walk, right? Well, we have our version of that, and that is the high heel that puts specific pressure on her bones. Other examples, think of maybe if you remember your prom, and all the girls were cold because they had lots of exposed skin, but the space was cooled in a way that for people who wore multiple layers, like their men in their suits, right? Not for her. Or tight skirts, which make it hard for her to move about, or corsets, classic example, or corsets. But the point is that these are expectations assigned to women, even in their daily dress, that limit their ability to move through space. So some of the other terms on here, sexual harassment. The point that I want to make about sexual harassment is this is completely subjective, right? I mean, organizations attempt to write a very specific kind of sexual harassment policy, but it all boils down to the perception of feeling uncomfortable or feeling threatened. And how do we measure that? And how do you prove that someone is uncomfortable? I mean, it boils down to their word against their word. And a colleague of mine made a comment the other day that sexual harassment really depends on who is directing the attention to who. If the person who is doing the quote unquote harassing is appealing and attractive, well, we might not define that as harassment. We might define that as flirting, right? So it's very subjective. The sociological significance of harassment is it's more likely to be a person of power acting in a way that makes a person with less power uncomfortable. So it's more likely to be identified or just called harassment when it's a superior, a boss, or somebody bigger, or in the classic gender stratification, it's a man who is making a woman or a superior, yeah, feel uncomfortable. And then, of course, there's some other statistics that murder 11%, men are 11% of the killer. Oh, women are 11% of the killers, but 21% of the victims. So murder is disproportionately done to women. The question about how the most dangerous place for a woman. So sometimes I use the example, or I'll ask a room, did any of the women got mace from their father when they turned 16? A lot of women carry mace. How many men carry mace? Very few men carry mace. Well, the assumption is, or the cultural message is, that women are likely to, or should be careful when they go out by themselves, right? That some stranger is going to harm them. But statistically, that's not the case. Statistically, a woman is much more likely to be hurt by somebody she knows in her own home. That's what the answer to this question is. The most dangerous place for a woman is not in the back alley of a bar, at closing time, when the bar closes down. It's in her own home. She is more likely to be victimized by someone she knows, and potentially someone she's even invited in, right? So this this domestic violence advocate that I used to listen to said, we tell women, we tell young girls, be careful, don't go there at night, but we don't say, or don't go there alone, don't, when you walk around the park, but we should be telling them, be careful who you date, be careful who you bring home, right? Because those are the people that are more likely to harm you. Okay, so here's the big F word, right? The big F word, feminism. What does feminism mean? Sometimes it's fun to ask people at the beginning of this topic if you are a feminist, and many people will say no. But then when you ask them questions about do you believe that men and women should be politically, economically, and socially equal? Get that definition, hear that. Men and women, women and men should be politically, economically, and socially equal. People will say yes. Well, that is the definition of feminism. Feminism is a philosophy that suggests that men and women should be equal. It is not a philosophy that says men are bad or that women are better. It is that people should be equal. Now, there have been different interpretations, and just same way you have that Christians all agree that Jesus is the Son of God, but there are various iterations of that, right? You have the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Lutherans and the Catholics, and they do everything different. There are differences under that general feminist umbrella, right? So you have the liberal feminists, and they would like to see changes, equality achieved through legislation, right? You have the radical feminists, and the radical feminists are a very small group. So to use the Christianity reference again, if you are familiar with, it escapes me right now, the guy, Westboro Baptist Church, right? And he will stand outside and say things like God hates fags, right? That's a really small segment of Christians. But yet, if that's all you knew about Christians, you would say, I'm not one of those. And the radical feminists are kind of like that too. It's a very small group of feminists, and their goal is equality, except they believe that men are in fact the oppressors, and the only way for women to achieve equality is by separating themselves from all relationships with the oppressors, right? You have the Marxist feminists, and the Marxist feminists argue that it's really the capitalist system, that the capitalist system benefits from the exploitation of women. So, or, yeah. And so the way that we would improve the status of women would be through the economy. So, for instance, if you paid the people who stay at home and take care of your children, right, which are most of the time women, if you paid them a living wage, that would mean that those wages could go into Social Security. For instance, the stay-at-home mom doesn't contribute to Social Security or a retirement package the same way that a woman in the labor force did. So that means in their old age, they are at an economic disadvantage. If you paid the women who stayed at home and took care of the kids, and she had a retirement account the same way he has one in the labor force, it would reduce inequality between men and women, right? And then the multicultural feminists, they're really interested. So it's called intersectionality. But from that philosophy would be the argument that the white woman's experience is very different than the black woman's experience, which is true, right? I mean, I cannot speak for the experience of a black woman in the economy, and so this iteration of feminist draws attention to the role of race. Okay, but that's sort of the point. And other things that I really want you to remember about feminism before I stop this one are, and there is a quiz question. I'm pretty sure there's a midterm and a final exam question about these two, are about the different waves or the different eras of the feminist movement, right? So know that the first era of feminism begins about with emancipation, with the ending of slavery, and it goes up until the 1920s. And their goal is to gain the right to vote for women, suffrage. The first wave is suffrage, which women get in 1920, 1921, right? They earn the right to vote because Africans, black people from Africa, were freed from slavery before women had the right to vote. And those two waves sort of go together. The second wave of feminism, these are the 1960s and the 1970s. Their goal was one, to establish laws against domestic violence, because it wasn't until, I want to say, 1981 that it was against the law for somebody's husband to beat her up, right? If you've heard of the term rule of thumb, that was a term often applied to that in some states it was perfectly legal for a man to beat his wife as long as it wasn't any bigger than his thumb. Because then this was also the era where we have some reproductive legislation that guaranteed women. So prior to 1972, 71 or 72, a woman could not legally get birth control. An unmarried woman could not legally get birth control. She had to get permission from her father or her husband. My mother was married in 1965, and she had to get permission from my father to use birth control. Right? Today, that would be, how many young women do you know that are using contraceptives? They didn't get permission from their father or from their mother or from their husband or their boyfriend to do that. So that comes about in the 1970s. This is also when we passed Roe versus Wade, and Roe versus Wade said that a woman's reproductive choices are her private matter. Right? And she should have the right, if she wants one, she should have the right to have an abortion. Right? So you get the right to access to birth control, the right to terminate your pregnancy, the right not to be beat up or raped by your husband, right? Because the third wave, and I proudly embrace a third wave feminist identity, is really one that says, first of all, women in the U.S. got it pretty darn good compared to women in other parts of the world, right? And so we need to be raising awareness of the status of women around the world, and also really challenging these notions of what gender means and what behaviors are assigned male or female. A third wave feminist, for instance, a second wave feminist might see a woman who stays at home and takes care of her kids as that's how you're oppressing the sisterhood. Don't stay at home, because if you stay at home and take care of your kids, then you're not in the workforce making life better for other women. A third wave feminist says, you know what? We have the freedom and the privilege to choose to stay at home or not. If a woman wants to stay at home and take care of her babies and live a traditional gender roles, that is her prerogative. But the same thing holds true for a man who wants to stay at home and take care of his babies. If you want to redo traditional gender roles, that's cool. If you want to follow traditional gender roles, that's cool too. So what I think of a third wave feminist is really a way of thinking about that we have women, the options for women today are greater than they've ever been, and we should take it. Everyone should have the right or the opportunity to make those decisions. Okay, I have one topic left, and that is the topic on theory, and I will come back. I'll start that in the last lecture slide.